So now we're going to begin looking at Chapter 4. Chapter 4, Engendered Lives by Julia Wood, contains information about men's movements. First, I'd like you to think about your discussion question for this week. Are you familiar with any men's movements going into this lecture? When we look at the men's movements, we see that they really existed for three different reasons. One is that there were men's movements that joined up with the women's movements to help them progress. Two, there were men's movements that were anti-feminist movements that were meant to secure men's place in society in the traditional roles they had always maintained. And then third, there were men's movements that looked at the current prescriptions for masculinity in American society and denounced it. So let's take a look at what that means. The first group, the pro-feminist men's movements, emerged in approximately the 1960s. Their goal was to join women's rights movements, and they really had two fundamental ideals. Male feminists supported the women's battles for equitable treatment, and they looked for men to have personal growth beyond the current societal prescriptions. In other words, perhaps endorsing men's higher levels of sensitivity, perhaps endorsing less traditionally masculine characteristics. One of the things that we look at is that no matter what kind of movement we're examining, whether it's the feminist movements from Chapter 3 or the masculine movements from Chapter 4, we see that rhetorical strategies are engaged in order to promote persuasion. When we talk about different rhetorical strategies, one of them that we consider, and this is a vocabulary word you should become familiar with, are what we call traitorous identity. This is when a group member criticizes the attitudes or actions that are common and accepted among the members of their own group. So, for example, women criticizing traditional behaviors of women, or men criticizing traditional behaviors of men. And the purpose of doing it is when a woman criticizes a man's demeanor, they can easily dismiss it as saying, she's not one of us, she doesn't understand. But when an insider, a group member, criticizes the behaviors of that group, they in fact realize that, wow, it's coming from one of us. This is challenging us more because we realize maybe we are doing something wrong. So we engage in traitorous identity techniques and tactics in order to get our own group members to change their current behaviors. One of the things that the liberal feminists said is that there's cultural prescriptions for both genders. Women are supposed to engage certain behaviors and so are men. And that these prescriptions are toxic. They're harmful to both men and women. And within this, the liberal feminists encourage men to be more sensitive, more caring, more open, more able to engage in meaningful, close relationships with men and women. And when they do this, they take on a new set of behaviors for men to follow. This is one of the ways that the men's movement of pro-feminism, the men's pro-feminist movement, engages men directly. From this movement, we see a couple of men's movements specifically fall out. They share the belief that the current views of masculinity are toxic, and they look to change them. The first group we see engage this for men is the National Organization for Men Against Sexism. This group condemns aggression, violence, and emotional insensitivity. They argue against the current prescriptions for men in American society. And they do this by focusing on four very specific areas. The first is they recognize and resist power and privilege. Now, as we've talked about earlier in the semester, privilege is something that you don't ask for. It's certain rights that are given to you by a society based on who you are. Sometimes that's based on your race, sometimes it's based on your ethnicity, sometimes it's based on your socioeconomic condition, and in this case they're looking at those privileges that are based solely on gender. The second thing that they look at is ending violence against women. Third, they look at ending homophobic attitudes. And lastly, they want to enrich men's studies at colleges and universities. Over time, women's studies have been enhanced and are increasing, and they're looking to see the same happen for men's. One of the other groups that surfaces around this time is the White Ribbon Campaign. This is a men's movement that works to end violence against women as coming from men. These men say, you know what, let's all designate a white ribbon as the symbol that we are opposed to violence against women. In addition to wearing these white ribbons, they host anti-violence workshops in schools, communities, and employment locations. The interesting part about the White Ribbon Campaign is it's a separatist movement. Women cannot join. This is for men about changing the behaviors of men in the way that they interact with women. The next group, and you'll see a quick link on your D2L page to watch more video footage of this, is about a group called Mentors in Violence Prevention. This is a group of men. Jackson Katz is one of the primary leaders of this group. And this group also goes around the country and talks to men about how they've been taught to be aggressive and violent through cultural views of masculinity and routine socialization throughout their entire lives. If they look at the behaviors that are promoted through everything from cartoons to movies to video games to music, they see that men are really taught to behave in this aggressive, violent manner. The other thing that they show is that men who don't choose that behavior still don't step in. And by that, they are a bystander who continues to perpetuate this horrible prescription for male behavior. From there, we'll go on and look at part 2 of the men's movements. You'll see here that I do have a YouTube link here. You can pull this up. This is again more information about mentors in violence prevention. But overall, when we look at when we summarize the movements we just looked at, we look at men who are arguing against the traditional prescription for masculinity in American society. This now, we transition and we look at the masculine men's movements. They say the polar opposite. These groups are looking to substantiate traditional masculine values and to really put those forward as an anti-feminist, anti-liberal feminist perspective. So this group says that overall, men suffer discrimination because of their sex and they need to reclaim their manliness. They use the strategy of verbally disparaging male and female feminists. Their goal is to restore the traditional roles of men and women in society. So let's take a look at the first men's movement that does this. There's a group called the Free Men. These men say that, in general, men have been wimpified and emasculated through the feminist movements. They've become nothing more than a meal ticket, reduced to only their paycheck. And it's their job to restore pride in being real men. They propose that macho images are the best, tough, rugged, and invulnerable. This is the prescription for the male that works. Another masculine movement we see come forward is interesting. It's called the Fathers' Rights Groups. Generically, they're Fathers' Rights Groups. The one in particular that you'll see the YouTube clip for is called Fathers for Justice. Here, they use the rhetorical strategy of crazy stunts and ridiculous behavior in order to gain enough attention, and then they remind society that men have rights with their children too. Now, when this group surfaces, what's going on in American society? Well, what we see is that the divorce rate has increased, and given the high number of divorces, custody battles are also in high number. And in most cases, women are given sole or primary custody of their children. These groups argue that that is absolutely not the way it should be and that men have the right to raise their children. You can watch the YouTube video to see exactly how they go about those. From this, we see a group called the Mythopoetic Men. Mythopoetic men follow the writings of Bly. And in the process of doing this, they look at fostering men's personal growth, advocating for masculine thinking. And we see a vocabulary word surface here, and it's called father hunger. And it argues that men look for a father figure, and if they're denied one, they will seek one in another situation. The adversaries of the Mythopoetic Men argue that it's an elitist group. From this, we see 1991 and 1992 lead to a whole different level of men's group, masculine groups, still part of the men's movement. But now we see a group called Promise Keepers, and they gain in momentum at a crazy speed. So in 1991, they have 4,200 men participating. 1992, they have 50,000. They have a 7-pillar premise. Their goal is to teach men to follow biblical teachings, love their wives, resist temptations in society for heavy levels of drinking, violence, and adultery, and to promote a high level of family values. But one of their key features here is that they maintain a masculine presence in their home, a dominance and a leadership role. This group kind of dwindles from the media rather quickly. And you'll see that I have a YouTube clip so that you can take a look at this quick link to see exactly what did this group do, what did they participate in, what did it look like when they all went to Washington, D.C. However, from this group, we move on to seeing just a couple years later another men's group come forward and promote what they call the Million Man March. This is a separatist movement. Not only is this only for men, it is only for African American men. And the notion that the media put forth is that, gosh, I don't really think they could have 1 million black men show up in Washington, D.C. Well, in 1995, they not only have 1 million, they have approximately 1.2 million men all show up in our nation's capital. You can watch the footage that I posted to see what that looked like and what types of things were said in the rallies and the conversations that were taking place. But the goal here was to raise the status of African American men in American society, to promote their head of household, to get them to be leaders in their community, to get them to be a part of their families. Because at this point, single head of household leadership in the African American community was typically held by the women. And so these men are saying, no, we need to reclaim our place in our families and in our communities, and they encourage black men to base their rage on racial identity rather than suffering and inequality. That is the end of the men's movements that we're going to take a look at. Now keep in mind, each of these men's movements was structured and set up in order to either promote masculinity traditionally in society, to negate it by participating in feminist movements, or to argue against the current societal prescriptions for men.